authorities moved quickly to say that the African Bank story was limited to African Bank and the way it was lending money. But what's happening now? Can we start questioning that?
I think the African Bank certainly was a temperature, a measure of a much deeper problem going on in terms of the whole debt market. The whole issue of subprime lending is quite a contentious one, because one of the problems is that poor people have not had access to finance, and so there's been various mechanisms to try and get them access to finance, but of course the National Credit Act moves against that, to prevent reckless lending and various circuit breakers, which have pushed a lot of poor people into the loan shark type area. In other words, people operating in the shadows, not quite under the legal operations. But at the same time, the subprime lending is proving to be a curse. And I use the term subprime lending very deliberately, because that's exactly what unsecured lending is. Because
just explain that a little bit more. So you mean that these people will find it harder to pay?
Well, let's put it this way. I can understand when the authorities are saying poor people don't have access to finance, say to fund their little business, a tuck shop or a spaza shop or whatever kind of business you've got in the township, and their short-term subprime financing is extremely useful for somebody who actually needs to get that, because it actually helps to underpin their livelihood. The only problem is most of the lending takes place to supplement people's income. In other words, it's for consumption purposes. So you buy the bed and you pay the funeral, or whatever the case is, the money is gone, and then you're left with a burden on already an income that was battling originally, and the person who's trying to carry that sinks further. At the same time, you've had the squeeze of administered prices, things like electricity prices and rates and taxes that have also been pushing up the cost of living, and at the same time you're then getting the squeeze, and the fallout then is, I can't pay my debt. It's as simple as that. And African Bank was the first casualty, but JD Group is a casualty, the furniture group's a casualty, anybody engaged in the subprime lending. And so you'll find in the banking system as a whole, right, where the big four will have been involved in subprime lending, but it's only a small part of their book. So you'll say their results are okay, pity about the subprime lending part of it, but they'll carry on as normal. The only trouble is African Bank only had subprime lending, and so when that went bad, the whole bank went bad. And that's where JD Group is trying to separate the retail side from its financing side, because it's the financing side that's got the bad, the bad debt that's killing
well,
it.
Shareholders are happy, so they're
Exactly.
making a good move in the eyes of investors, sort of getting out of the bad debt.
And likewise with
market,
Ellerines, there's some very good brands there that they've got, and very well established brands as well. But unfortunately, they've got this financing side, and I think where the mistake with African Bank and the furniture group was, they said, well, it looks such a similar business. I don't think although furniture companies often make their money through the financing side, I don't think it's a bank can run a furniture operation. It's still, as the core business, sells furniture. How it makes its money might look like banking, but it still needs to have a good furniture selling operation.
Could we, Chris, see this run like blocks of Lego? It started with African Bank, JD Group now vulnerable. Well, what about the retailers who are giving people cards to buy things like clothes?
That's all subprime lending.
But are there any companies out there very vulnerable right now?
Yes, all of them who've got a big chunk of this on their books, and they've booked to profits, and they'll suddenly hit a wall. You see, what I'm worried about more in the next few months is people who've been taking out subprime loans to settle other subprime loans, and now suddenly the sector's going sour, so nobody wants to lend. So where they've been rolling the debt, they suddenly hit a wall. They can't roll over that debt, and they've got the previous debt to pay, and then suddenly you find a cascading of bad debt coming through as well.
We're here today, now weeks after African Bank basically collapsed. The Reserve Bank is going to investigate African Bank for reckless lending. And you were speaking about the laws that we do have that are considered quite robust.
Yes.
But have we had a failing of regulation?
Well, I think it's a good question, because too often people look at and say that's market failure when it's actually regulatory failure. Now, there's two regulatory bodies. One's the National Credit, then the National Credit Act, and it's the National Credit, and they've got a separate authority where you can appeal whether it's bad lending. What I think the Reserve Bank is looking at is, was the actual African Bank operations run recklessly, in other words, the operations itself, let alone the lending. So obviously, was there a bit of cowboy corporate governance? That's, I think, what they might be looking at. But it doesn't matter. The point is that when something goes wrong, then all of the cobwebs comes out. Now, you'll for instance have an instance that I think Standard Bank came out. They had good results, except that there was a Chinese copper or aluminium financing operation in China that went belly up. There was a fraud there, etc. But they're so big that that's just it doesn't affect the viability of the actual bank. You say, you write it off that quarter, we'll make it up, somewhere else next quarter, etc. But if that was their only and prime lending arm, then they'll be going under. And that's the African Bank's problem. They only had one string to their bow, and when that string broke, the business broke. And so you'll find in all instances, the banks will have very good results. Just pity about that, and very good results, but we paying attention to something, but they've got the ability to absorb a bad decision.
Chris, we have to leave it there, but thank you so much for your analysis, and we will follow that investigation by the Reserve Bank announced today into possible reckless behavior at African Bank.